So good afternoon, everyone. The Authors at Google New York is pleased to welcome Eric Alterman, who is here today to talk about his book, Kabuki Democracy, The System versus Barack Obama. Eric Alterman is a CUNY Distinguished Professor of English and Journalism, a media columnist at The Nation, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and author of 7 books, including the national bestsellers, What Liberal Media and the book on Bush. Please welcome Eric Alterman.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I got somebody else's notes up here. Let's see. Maybe their talk is better than mine. Okay. I spoke, for my last book, I spoke in Mountain View. You guys are much better looking and more fun than they are. This book I wrote, Kabuki Democracy, it has, I meant to look this up from the last time I talked about it. It has 2 separate geneses. That's geneses, plural of genocide, genesis. One is I had, Barack Obama invited me to dinner in 2005, yeah, right after he became a senator. And it was about, I don't know, 7 or 8 people at dinner. And I had no opinion of him except that I had heard good things about him. I actually didn't watch his convention speech. I played poker that night. I was at the convention, but I never watched the keynote speech because I always find it frustrating that you end up wishing that guy were the nominee. It happened. The first convention I went to was 1984 with Mario Cuomo, and ever since then, the one exception actually was Bill Clinton. He was a terrible keynote in 1988. But anyway. So I had dinner with Obama, and I'd heard good things about him. But like I said, I didn't know anything at all about him except that he was the only African-American member of the Senate, and he had been a community organizer. And I guess this happens to a lot of people. I just was really struck by his normalcy. I was struck by his intelligence, by his self-confidence. I guess you could call it charm. I mean, I was definitely charmed, but I was more struck by how you could just talk to this guy who I mean, at that point, if you remember 2005, when Bush defeated Kerry, despite the war being in absolutely terrible shape, and the revelations at Abu Ghraib and all the horrible things that the Bush administration was doing, both in terms of violating our values, but also straightforward incompetence. The fact that the Democrats could lose that election was really depressing, and just about the only person that people took any hope from at that point was this young guy from Chicago, Barack Obama, and in fact, I remember he said that, and again, this was very early in 1985. He said at his very first press conference, as a senator from Illinois, he was asked, "What do you think your legacy will be?" And he thought that was odd because he had it was like his first day on the job. So he was under enormous pressure and a microscope, and yet he talked about problems the way my friends and I talked about problems. And, you know, we were roughly the same age. I'm a little bit older than he is, less than a year. And I came away from that meeting buoyed, B-U-O-I-E-D, buoyed, by meeting a politician who had been able to navigate our political system, which has so many problems and so much built-in corruption to it. And to think that, you know, I thought that maybe 20 years from now he might be able to run for president. And I was glad that I would be alive for that, I figured, unless I were hit by a car or killed as an innocent bystander. I'm one of those people who always thinks I'll be killed as an innocent bystander. So that's Genesis number 1. Genesis number 2, I had dinner with a friend of mine who is also a funder and funds me sometimes, and says, "What would you like me to fund?" And I was thinking that, I don't know, I can't watch American politics on in real time. I find it too annoying and depressing at the same time to listen to American politicians speak, because they're so full of themselves, and the language that they use is so divorced from reality, but also just from language. It insults me the way that the speeches that are given in political talk. It bears out very, very much George Orwell's observation about political speech being, I forget what he said, but it had a lot to do with hot air in that quote. Anyway, but I need to know what's going on, and I need to actually see these people sometimes. So the solution to my problem, and it's a very good one, I recommend it, is that every morning I watch on DVR Colbert and Stewart. And there you get to see what people are talking about, and you get to see these actual people, and you don't have to see too much of them. You just get little snippets of them, and I can live with that. But the thing about watching Colbert and Stewart, or just following the news on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis, is that the way our media cover news, and in this I include all of our media. One thing I always have to point out when I teach, I'm a professor of English, I always have to remind people that the word media is a plural noun, and that the proper way to say media is to say the media are, not the media is. And it's very important because the media are an enormous amalgam of different kinds of institutions that have very little in common with one another. And you can say, if you want to blame the media, you can blame the media for almost anything, and it'll be true, because there'll be some aspect of the media that you'll be telling the truth about, but it won't be true about most of the other institutions. But one thing that does strike me as true about just about all media is the fact that these institutions all hop around from issue to issue, from day to day, as if the previous day hadn't happened, as if the previous problem hadn't happened. So all of a sudden, everybody's concerned about oil drilling, and the dangers of oil drilling, offshore oil drilling, whereas the problems that created the conditions that led to the Gulf of Mexico being inundated with oil had been there for years. And if you go back and look at all of the different decisions that went into that went uncovered by any member of the media, you could actually predict a kind of disaster like the one we experienced last year. And in fact, not a single media institution, not one, had a reporter whose full-time job was to cover the MMS, the minerals and whatever it's called. And then, of course, we get a disaster, and everybody becomes an expert overnight on it, and the disaster lasts as long as it has news value, and then we go on to the next disaster. So we lurch from issue to issue, and every night, you can watch the news, or you can click on your browser and get updates, or pick up the newspaper if you're old-fashioned like I am in the morning, and become enormously concerned about something that you had totally forgotten about and will probably totally forget about in 48 hours or 72 hours, or if it's a terrorist attack, you might get a couple weeks out of it. So when I was asked what I would like to write by my friend who was willing to help pay for me to do it, I said, well, I would like to take some time and figure out why Barack Obama can't do most of the things. He can't do 100% of any of the things that he promised to do, even though he had a supermajorities in both houses of Congress, number one. But he can't even do most of the things he promised to do. And the reasons are complicated, they're related, and they're not going away. In other words, the coverage, when something is held up by a filibuster, it took a long time to get the gays in the military bill passed, because of the filibuster and because of individual holds and so forth. And eventually it was passed in a special lame duck session of Congress. But for years it was held up by these methods of obfuscation and delay that are available to any senator. And again, these things are used across the board on every issue of interest to any particular special interest, and they tend to be ignored because our media are not interested in the mechanics of how our politics works. They're only interested in the personalities, and in the case of Fox and organizations like Fox, and the ideology. But actually, the way that things actually work and the interest behind them and the lobbyists who are paying for the campaigns that determine the shape of things, determine the nature of proposals, determine what gets in and out of committee, these things are never covered. You have to be a specialist to pay attention to these. So instead of allowing myself to be driven crazy every morning, I decided to just take notes on all of the different institutional problems that I could identify that prevented Barack Obama from making good on his campaign promises, despite the fact that he had supermajorities in both Congress. Because don't forget, if you elect a president, I mean, if you have supermajorities in both Congress and a president of the same party, you're really working with the equivalent of a parliamentary system, because it's not divided government anymore. The opposition does not have the power to prevent you from making your will into law. And one problem, I mean, our constitutional system is set up to make passing laws very difficult, in many respects for good reasons. But in that sense, but because of that, there's a sort of disconnect between what politicians say they will do and what we are able to hold them responsible for having done. There's always some excuse as to why they couldn't why you actually were stupid to believe what they were promising you in the first place. But when you have supermajorities in both houses, you lose that excuse. There's nothing standing in the way, theoretically, from the entire panoply of Barack Obama's promises being made into law, and those would include a public option on health care, a very strong commitment, in this case through cap and trade, to curb global warming, much stronger support for unions through the card check laws, and certainly, and this was the issue that I thought was clearest, because healthcare is very complicated, and certainly environmental protection and global warming is very complicated, but financial regulation was not complicated in this case. I mean, it is complicated when you get into the details, but what was uncomplicated about it was the politics, that everybody understood that the banks, through their own irresponsibility, had made a financial crisis that was much, much worse than it ever needed to be, that this had cost tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people their jobs, same number of people their homes. The economy, because of the hit that we were taking, was hemorrhaging when Barack Obama came to power, 80,000 jobs a month. And of course, the stock market had lost, I don't know, about 30% of its value, 30% of its value. It was an enormous crisis, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And we knew not only who the culprits were, but what the problem was. And the problem is that the system encouraged all kinds of risk on behalf of certain people who controlled enormous amounts of money at the banks, and yet there was no system built in for them to take responsibility for when those risks went sour. Because they were too big to fail, they could reap the rewards of their of the millions of dollars they made when they made risky trades that went all right, or looked all right, didn't even go all right, but they looked all right for a while. But when they went sour, the taxpayers had to pick up the bill. And so why wouldn't you do that? I mean, you know, if the house is going to give you all the money you need to play poker, why wouldn't you just bet every time, and maybe your hand will turn out to win? You've got nothing to lose. Well, there were a number of provisions in the financial reform bill that would have prevented that from being the case in the future, and none of them were able to be passed. So that we got a financial reform bill. It surprised people. If you remember, if you read the coverage carefully when the bill was passed, people were surprised at how tough it was. And it was tough because the indictment of Goldman Sachs sort of shine the spotlight on some of the practices that gave certain congressmen some extra courage that they needed to vote in a way that surprised people. But even so, none of the primary practices that people identified as having caused the crisis are we now protected from. They're all going to happen again because, again, it's just in the self-interest of the people running the system to keep behaving that way. They're still playing with the House's money. And so I tried to look deep into the system using the cases of the healthcare bill, of the cap and trade bill, and of the financial reform bill. And I also spent a lot of time looking at the causes of the oil spill from a regulatory perspective. And I try to identify all of the different ways that the president is prevented from making good on his promises. Because I submit that if you have a president who has a supermajority, who can't make good on his promises, even with a supermajority, you don't really have a functioning democracy. Because when you vote for someone and he says, I'll do this, and nothing is preventing him from doing it, and he still doesn't do it, I mean, nothing apparently in the political system, then your vote is you're voting for a fictional character. You're voting for someone who can't, your vote becomes a lot less meaningful up to the point of being meaningless. And the answers are complicated. I mean, part of the answers have to do with our constitutional system and are just about impossible to fix. I mean, if you live in California, your vote is worth 1/12 of what it is in Wyoming, because you get the same number of senators for 12 times the population as they do in Oregon. So it just so happens that the most conservative states in our country are the most underpopulated states. So, for instance, when you have a filibuster of 40 senators, and remember, you don't even have to have a filibuster anymore. You just have to say you would have a filibuster. You don't have to bother to actually filibuster anymore, like they do in the Jimmy Stewart movies. Those are now part of black and white movies. But if you say you're going to filibuster something and you have the votes, which is 40 votes, you only really need to represent about barely 30% of the country. In fact, the 40 senators who did filibuster everything that the Democrats proposed in the past 2 years did represent exactly 33% of the country. The Republicans, if you do the math, the 40 senators we had in the 111th Congress represented 33% of the country, and that 33% of the country could hold up the entire will of the majority on everything. And that really can't be fixed, because if you're part of that minority, you're going to like that. That's very good to have all that power. Wyoming is not going to voluntarily give up its 12 times as much power in the Senate as California, and because it's so difficult to pass a constitutional amendment, which is the only way to do it, it's not going to happen. But in terms of the rules of the Senate, that could easily change if the individual senators were willing to give up some of their personal prerogatives for either the good of democracy or just the good of their team. Now, interestingly, the Republicans are much better team players than the Democrats. The Republicans realized with Obama that they would only have any influence if they stuck together 100% of the time as a complete unit. And they did it. And so even people who didn't agree with what the majority of their party wanted stuck with it, so that the next time they wanted something, they would get it. Democrats are incapable of doing that. There are a lot of reasons for that, in part because the Democratic Party is a much wider ideological party than the Republicans, but also because the Republicans are meaner and nastier. When people don't agree, when people don't behave the way that their activists want, they run primaries against them, and sometimes they beat them. And they beat them with the craziest people imaginable, like Christine O'Donnell and Sharon Angle. I mean, and I use crazy advisedly. I mean, this is going to go up on Google, right? So they can sue me if they want, but I think I can prove that they're nuts. I mean, if you listen to some of the things they say. And they're not serious. I mean, in fact, if the Republicans hadn't run Angle or O'Donnell and a couple of others, they would have taken over the Senate. they ran not credible candidates, and they're willing to punish their own members on behalf of party unity to that degree, to a way that there were no Democratic challenges to any of the Democrats who didn't support Obama on health care, for instance. Whereas if the situation would have been reversed, it would have been the opposite. There's a story I tell where there was this fellow, Obama, it wasn't clear once the whole health care thing came down, the tough vote was going to be in the House, not in the Senate, if you remember, the really close vote. And it wasn't clear how in the world Nancy Pelosi was going to get those votes. And she ended up having to give away the right to choice in your health care plan, which was really surprising that Democrats go along with that. I'm glad they did. I think it was the right thing. But still, it's hard to get every little faction to go along with you. So at the same time, the Republicans were incredibly self-disciplined in terms of how their members behaved. And remember, at the end of a session of Congress, the people in Congress, who are all ambitious beyond being mere congressmen, they're all planning their next move. Some of them want to run for senator, some of them are governor, some of them might want to be mayor, of a large town in their districts. So the Republicans, they would punish anyone who made plans not to be there for any important vote for any reason. It didn't matter what the reason was. The Democrats had this representative from Hawaii named Neil Abercrombie, who ran for governor. And in order to run for governor, he quit his seat in Congress right before the vote on health care. And what did the Democrats do? They gave him a going-away party. And you know what? He didn't even bother to show up. He was already in Hawaii. They had a party without him to celebrate the fact that they just didn't have any ability to discipline their members. So that's a cultural problem that is very frustrating, and it's hard to know what to do about. And it's difficult for citizens to do anything about that except to punish their representatives. But again, I don't even know how you would go about doing that. One of the most significant roadblocks to democracy in present-day America that doesn't get talked about much, though, is the power and culture of finance. It's not simply that lobbyists pay for political campaigns and then get the members to vote the way they want, or not even to vote the way they want, but to kill bills before they're voted on, or to be playing golf on the day that the vote is taking place, or to change the language in a way that nobody else can understand it, but gives them what they want, which is an awful lot of what happened with the financial reform bill. But there's a culture. The Italian communist philosopher who was imprisoned during World War II, Antonio Gramsci, talked about the way that ruling classes use culture to get people to do things in the interest of the ruling class without resort to force. And people don't even, it becomes second nature to them. And this is the genius of these ruling class, because it's a lot cheaper and simpler to do things that way. And if you look at the way the ideology of finance and laissez-faire economics has overturned what had been about a half century of Keynesianism over the past 40 years, you can see the power of the culture of finance operating in our political system, so that any government intervention for any reason has to be justified in the context of a ideology that is deeply antithetical to the very idea of government intervention. I mean, today we have people like Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker saying they went much too far and they had much too much faith in the system, and they now regret that they didn't see that the system wasn't perfect and needed some sort of adult supervision. But it's very, very difficult for anyone in power. They said this out long after they were no longer chief of the Fed or Secretary of the Treasury. But it's very, very difficult for anyone in power to make a statement like that, because it makes them appear untrustworthy to the entire system. And there's just no point in it. There's just no point in trying to poke holes in this ideology that is so widely accepted, taught in business schools, permeates the business sections of all the newspapers and actually goes much deeper than that. And what the system does is it raises private concerns to the equal or even more important to public concerns in public policy making, so that the lobbyists, the individual lobbyists for individual companies, their interest is seen as important, if not more important, than the broader public. And so, for instance, during the finance negotiations, Goldman Sachs hired away the chief of the House Banking Committee, who was working for Barney Frank, who's, a big liberal Democrat. They hired him away during the negotiations. And nobody thought there was anything wrong with that. That you can move from representing the public interest to the private interest. On the very same time, you can basically switch sides in the fight. I mean, think about it. The guy who was writing the bill that was regulating Goldman Sachs one day is working for Goldman Sachs the next day. There's no law against it. There's not even any cultural, social disapproval of it. Everyone who works for the House Banking Committee and who works for the Senate Finance Committee either will work for one of these banks or has worked for one of these banks, and probably both. Probably has and probably will again. Probably will again. And that's just the way it is. I mean, and if you think about it from their perspective, well, why not? It's very difficult to maintain one's idealism when one goes to Washington in one's 20s to try and change the world. And yet you see the same people who you grew up with and went to school with and socialized with, and they're making 3, 5, 10 times what you're making for doing essentially the same work. And they have a lot more freedom. And, they're picking up the check at dinner, and you're feeling like a loser. And then they offer you the opportunity to live that life. And why not? There's no sanction against it. Nobody's going to look down on it. You can have all the things that you're, that you'd like to give your family. And it's not like, if you're a Mexican policeman and the drug dealers come to you and say, we're either going to kill you or give you $1 million, you can understand why you would work with drug dealers rather than have yourself killed or your family killed. It's a brutal world out there. In the United States, we have a much more pleasant choice, which is you can work 20 hours a week in a little cubicle for $110,000 a year, or we can give you an office for the staff and a car and a credit card, and we'll pay you $750,000 a year. And people will like you better, People will think you're cooler than you were. It's very hard to resist. And as long as the culture treats it as okay, then there's no reason not to do it. So both the ideology and the culture of the way we treat money in our society becomes so powerful that the public interest becomes entirely lost. So right now, you had the entire country mad at these guys, really wanting A, punishment, and B, preventative medicine, and you couldn't get it. You could only get about 10% of what was needed. And that was then. The rules are still being written today. The rules, the language is very highfalutin in these laws. But the actual rules are very detailed. And those are all being written without any public scrutiny whatsoever. There are no reporters there. So the lobbyists are still there, and they're getting what they want. And that's how the system works. Now, finally, I've talked a little bit longer than I intended, but finally you have the transformation of the media that's taken place in the past 20 or 30 years. I've written a few books about this, and I don't want to make my talk entirely about that, but it has two basic components. One is the growth of the alternative conservative media, Fox News, cable news, Rush Limbaugh, Drudge, the internet. And these have put enormous pressure on what used to be the establishment news because these people are profitable, and their viewers are really dedicated. So even though not that many people watch Fox, a lot of people watch Fox compared to CNN and MSNBC. They have more viewers than both of those stations combined. But it's only still 2-3 million people in a country of 300 million people. It's not that many people, but they carry enormous influence inside the universe of the news media because they've created a successful model when the rest of the media appear to be dying. So Fox and the conservatives have gotten more and more powerful in terms of defining the playing field of how we debate things, how we discuss things. The idea that you can talk about death panels and have it be credible when there isn't any evidence for it at all, but it becomes a real issue that the president has to address. Or something like Acorn. I spend a lot of time on the Acorn issue here because it's just crazy that George Stephanopoulos would think it was worth asking the president about Acorn during our interview right before he was getting to the Afghanistan war. The government, the U.S. government budget, if you take the whole year of the budget, it would spend 15 seconds on what goes to Acorn. It would have. Now nothing goes, but it was 15 seconds worth of it. The president doesn't think about things like that. But the issue became so important because of the ginning up of this machine that is. You see the tip of the submarine in Fox News, and it's a very important part of it. But what I try to point out about Fox News, that's really important to notice, is that it's not a news organization; it's a political organization. It's a lot like what Berlusconi has in Italy. It's just that the head of it is not the same head as the president. But for instance, right now, every single, with the exception of Mitt Romney, every single Republican presidential candidate who is not in public office is on the payroll of Fox News. So they're getting the equivalent, I think, in the last year, if you made them pay for the airtime they get at Fox News made a $60 million contribution to their campaigns, and they never get any tough questions. They're just there, basically campaigning. And the opposite works as well. The way Fox News describes, and Rush Limbaugh and the entire structure describes the opposition, is it weird that 24% of registered Republicans think that Barack Obama not only is a Muslim, but is actually trying to turn the United States into an Islamic republic? Really? 24% of Republicans, 18%. That number keeps rising, just like the number of people who think that global warming is a hoax has risen since the president, since the 2008 election. That's problem one. Problem two is that, it's ironic that I'm saying this here at Google. As I'm sure you've all heard, the economic model for the news media has broken down, and it's no longer a business. Newspapers are no longer a business. Television news is no longer a business. There are some niche products that are good businesses on the internet, but they're very few and far between, and there's no formula. The old formula is you aggregate eyeballs, and you sell those eyeballs to advertisers. And the actual eyeballs pay a very small portion of the freight. The last time I checked, and this is probably not the case anymore because of the destruction of these news organizations, but in New York Times, if you took all the readers of the New York Times and you took all the production costs of creating a New York Times, particularly the reporting and editing, you'd have to charge people $40 a newspaper to pay to cover those costs. And so the difference between $2 a newspaper and $40 a newspaper is advertising money that pays to reach those people. Well, those advertisers are disappearing for a lot of reasons, which you don't need me to explain to you. That's why you guys have this nice place here. So at the same time, you have all these new irresponsible forms of journalism brewing. You have the formerly responsible forms of journalism dying. Now, I'm not one of those people who says this is all a terrible thing. I think there are a lot of really excellent and wonderful and democratic things that have arisen from the digitalization of communication and news in particular. I make my living, by and large, on the internet. I think it's great. I have much closer communication with my readers, and I learn things. I learn a lot more about things much more easily than I ever could have, and I know a lot more as a result. And to the degree that people participate in digital democracy, it's a much better democracy than we have, particularly in terms of information. But the cost of it is that we allow all kinds of nonsense and chicanery and jingoism and I can use a lot of unpleasant words here, to go unchecked because the gatekeeper function has been destroyed. And so a president who is trying to make a case on something as complicated as cap and trade or health care no longer has the ability to reach the public with a complicated case. Everything has to be stated in really catchy, really quick phrases that face a mountain of disinformation that feels no responsibility at all to correct itself, to give a fair hearing to the truth. I could give you example. I mean, this is what you learn by watching The Daily Show, but I could give you example after example of these cable stations, and it's not only Fox News, of just saying things that are flat out untrue. They're obviously untrue. I mean, you all must have noticed that story about how Barack Obama spent like $200 million a day going to India or something? I mean, the source, and this ran everywhere, but the source was an unnamed local regional official in India who would have no idea. Somebody quoted somebody once, and it's picked up, and this machine takes it over, and then it becomes, it crowds out all the rest of the news so that anything that the president or his side wants to say can't be heard. So at the end of the book, I try and be constructive and make a series of proposals over how to counter these things. But my primary argument is that for people to take a look at the whole system and see that the system, because of the power of money, because of the dysfunction of our institutions, and because of the transformation of the media, it's really no longer has the substance of democracy. It's become a kind of Kabuki democracy, where, and sometimes people tell me I'm misusing the word kabuki and I'm unfair to kabuki theater, but it seems to be consistent with people's idea of kabuki, at least mine, which is that people are sort of acting, going through the motions, without any of the substance, without any of the actual dialogue, and pretending to have a democracy without the most fundamental aspect of it being the case, which is that people's vote actually has the ability to change the system. It's not people's vote. It's people's money. It's people's influence, and it's people's willingness to behave irresponsibly in support of their goals. And with the transformation of our politics in the extreme direction that it's gone in, and the rewards for that extremism, this problem is only going to get worse unless we start to take it seriously. So even though it's complicated and it takes a long time to explain, I personally don't think we can continue to act as if it isn't there. So thanks for listening. Sure. Thank you.
You mentioned the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party,
Yep.
and the discipline that the Republican Party has. What do you think is best for our country? Because on one hand, you've got the Republican Party that seems to be more efficient, but on the other hand, you've got the Democratic Party that seems to believe in the exchange of ideals, and not forcing one person to go with the bigger party.
Good question. The Republicans have basically purged their moderates from their party. They've become an ideological party, a conservative party. That's why there's almost no Republicans in the Northeast and New England anymore, and there are no Democrats anymore in the South. There's about 3 or 4 remaining dinosaurs in the Republican Party, like Olympia Snow, and a couple others in New England, and they will lose their seats shortly. So the Republican Party is a party that is answerable to its activist wing, and if they don't toe the line, they're shot down. And the Democrats are not. The Democrats are an establishment party, and by and large a centrist party. By and large, they're always trying to find what the swing voter wants and give it to them, and ask their activists just to keep quiet and wait their turn. And you know, if you notice, Barack Obama and his advisors are always making fun of liberals and saying, oh, they're whining about not getting everything they wanted, whereas Republicans never do that. Republicans are really respectful of their base, no matter how crazy they are. Now, in a parliamentary system, you would want parties like Republican parties so that everybody's interests could be fairly represented. So if I happen to have this particular group of like in Israel, you've got all these little parties that represent very particular points of view. You've got like a dozen parties, and they each need to get 5%. They have a threshold of 5% to be seated in the parliament. But in our system, you've got a winner-take-all system, where if you get one vote more than the other side gets, you get all of the seats. You get the entire presidency. You don't need a majority. You just need one vote more than anybody else. So it doesn't make any sense to have anything to try and make your party as small and ideological as you can in terms of winning. You want to have a broad coalition to win and then fight it out once you've won. The problem with that, and I think it's a clear problem for the Democrats, is that if you have all of these disparate people with disagreements in your party, it's very hard to say what you stand for, right? So we know what the Republicans believe in. We know what conservatives in the country believe in: small government, less taxes, fewer immigrants, kick ass in the rest of the world, no making nice with other countries that give us a hard time. But what do the Democrats believe? I don't think anybody can really explain it. So because our politics are so personalized, people like to vote for the stronger sounding person. You have to be really crazy to be too crazy to get elected in this country if you sound like you know what you're talking about. So the Republicans have actually stepped over, because of the Tea Party, they've managed to step over that line a little bit in the last election. But I think that it's my impression, and this is just a feeling, but I think it's true. I've been watching this stuff for 30, 40 years. I think Americans admire people who know what they stand for, who can articulate it, who can speak for it in a strong way without hemming and hawing. And that's more important to them than whether or not they actually agree with what the person's saying. That they vote much more on the strength of personality than they do on the issues. They don't pay that much attention to the issues. So I think the Democrats would be much better off with a stronger, more focused, more ideological party than they are with the party they have today, more like the Republicans. I think the Republicans make more sense. But you could make an argument for the other side, and they might be right too. It's a very tough question. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for speaking today. And second, you said at the end of your talk that we need to take things more seriously. And given the systemic difficulties that we have, and the fact that, like you said, the president just named his chief of staff as someone who came from the financial industry. So any lessons around the economic problems that we've had are seemingly lost. And how do you said we need to take it more seriously and take our democracy more seriously. So what ways do you suggest that we do that, and what is available to us?
Oh boy. Well, I do try and address that in the conclusion of my book, and it's long, and I don't really have any simple answers for that. But I think that, what the right has done over the past 40 years is to move the center in their direction. So that, Barack Obama not only chose a guy from the financial industry, William Daley, but he chose a guy who didn't support his health care program. The most important, the thing he should be proudest of, the thing he put most of his time in, the thing that his presidency will rise and fall on in terms of, what are his signal accomplishments. He picked a guy who was against all that. And he did it because the narrative demanded that he move to the center, that he be more friendly to business. Now remember, business got 90% of what it wanted out of the financial bill. They defined the shape of the health care bill. They defeated cap and trade, and yet Obama is perceived as being anti-business. In fact, I would say, numbers about 30% of people, 30% consider Obama to be a socialist, as if we somehow elected a socialist to be our president. This is the power of the right-wing media and conservative institutions who began this process in the early 1970s to redefine the playing field of American politics, and they have succeeded. And before anything can really be accomplished on the kinds of issues that you raise, the other side needs to organize itself for a long-term battle of ideas in the same way. And those investments need to be made. Most of the funders in the Democratic Party now are sort of the kinds of people who have founded Google and Silicon Valley institutions, entrepreneurs. And I have nothing at all against entrepreneurs. They're very important, and where would we be without them? But they want results. They want quarterly results, or maybe annual results at best. And these investments take decades, and the Republicans have they've wasted a lot of money. The conservatives, they've wasted a lot of money building their structures because it's hard to know what will work. It's impossible to know what will work, and you got to give things time. And when you think about it from a entrepreneurial standpoint, an awful lot of angel money, goes out the window over time. But the one thing that sticks pays for everything else. And yet, in politics, this money is expected to show results overnight, and so that groups like the Democracy Alliance, which is all these Democratic billionaires and millionaires who've committed a certain number, $800,000, I think, over a period of, I don't know exactly what the period is, but a lot of money. They have a structure that demands all kinds of benchmarks be met that are appropriate to business, but not appropriate to the world of ideas. And so the first thing I would ask for would be patient investing in ideas. That would be number one. And then number two, I would ask for less caution, less fear to give voice to one's ideas. That not, you can take back what you said if it turns out you were wrong. But there's so much nervousness about being the target. I mean, when the Gulf War happened, Bill O'Reilly put my picture up on the television screen as a mugshot because I opposed the Gulf War. Like, I was guilty of something, of having a difference of opinion with Fox News, and I was fine with that because I don't make my living on whether or not Fox News likes me, and none of my friends were going to stop being friends with me, and I was going to keep getting invited to parties. Like, it didn't hurt me anyway. I enjoyed it. But if you're in, if you're in the real world, it can be really scary. It can be a real problem for you, particularly as they get meaner and meaner, and occasionally people get shot or get threatened. One of my colleagues at CUNY is now the target of a Glenn Beck attack that is quite scary. The New York Times wrote an article about it this week, about how she's getting death threats, and Beck is using really incendiary language about her. And she's just writing articles about politics. So we need a little bit more courage, and we need a longer-term investment, and we need to ape their ability to discipline themselves. That would be, I guess, the three broad categories that I would. Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks for listening. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me.